Thomas McKenna was a man who had learned to live with silence. For nearly 5 years now, he'd been alone on his ranch in Montana. Just him and the endless stretches of land that seemed to go on forever. He was 42 years old, though the hard work and loneliness had added a few extra years to his face. His wife had died from a terrible fever, and after that something inside him just broke. He couldn't bear to be around people anymore. Every face reminded him of what he'd lost. His ranch was huge, sprawling across the Montana wilderness like a sea of grass and rock. The Rocky Mountains stood in the distance, their peaks covered in snow even in summer. From his cabin window he could see for miles in every direction, and most days he wouldn't spot a single soul. His nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and that was just fine with Thomas. He'd built his life around avoiding people, around keeping his heart safe from any more pain. The folks in the nearby town of Copper Ridge thought he was strange. When he rode into town for supplies, which wasn't often, they'd whisper about him. The hermit rancher, they called him. The man who chose cows and horses over human company. They didn't understand, and Thomas didn't expect them to. How could they know what it felt like to lose the one person who made life worth living? How could they understand that every conversation, every smile, every bit of kindness from others just reminded him of her absence? His days followed the same pattern week after week, month after month. He'd wake up before dawn, make himself some coffee, and head out to check on the cattle. He had about 200 head of cattle scattered across his land, and they needed constant attention. There were fences to mend, water sources to check, and predators to watch for. Wolves and mountain lions were always a threat, and Thomas had become a crack shot with his rifle out of necessity. The work was hard and never-ending, but Thomas preferred it that way. When his body was tired, his mind couldn't wander as much. He couldn't think about the sound of her laugh or the way she used to hum while cooking dinner. The physical exhaustion helped him sleep at night, though his dreams still found him sometimes, bringing back memories that made waking up hurt all over again. He'd built the cabin himself, years ago when they first arrived, full of hope and dreams. It was simple but solid, made from logs he'd cut and hauled from the forest. One main room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace that he'd laid with his own hands. A small bedroom in the back and a loft above where they'd planned to raise children someday. That never happened. Now the cabin felt too big and too empty, echoing with silence. Thomas kept the place clean more out of habit than care. He'd wash his dishes, sweep the floors, and keep things organized. But there was no warmth there anymore, no life. The curtains she'd sewn still hung in the windows, faded now from years of sun. Her rocking chair sat in the corner, and he could never bring himself to sit in it or move it away. It just stayed there, a ghost of happier times. Most evenings, after the work was done, he'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the sun go down. The Montana sunsets were something special, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and red. She used to love watching them with him. Now he watched alone, and the beauty of it just made the loneliness sharper. He talked to his horse sometimes, a big bay gelding named Duke. The horse didn't judge him or expect anything except food and water and the occasional pat on the neck. Thomas found himself saying things to Duke that he'd never say to another person. His fears, his regrets, his bone-deep tiredness of being alone. The horse would just flick his ears and keep eating, and somehow that was comforting. Winter was the hardest time. The snow would pile up deep, sometimes trapping him in the cabin for days at a time. The wind would howl like a living thing, rattling the windows and finding every crack in the walls. He'd sit by the fire reading the same books over and over or just staring into the flames. Those were the times when the silence became almost unbearable, when the walls seemed to close in and the loneliness felt like it might swallow him whole. But spring always came eventually, melting the snow and bringing life back to the land. The cattle would get frisky, happy to be out of the worst weather. Wildflowers would bloom across the meadows, turning the brown landscape into a carpet of colors. Thomas would feel something almost like hope during those times, a sense that maybe life could continue, even if it would never be the same. He'd tried to leave once, about 2 years after she died. Packed up his things, planning to sell the ranch and start over somewhere else. But when it came time to actually go, he couldn't do it. This land held every memory of her, every dream they'd shared. Leaving would mean letting go completely, and he wasn't ready for that. Maybe he never would be, so he stayed. This lonely man on his lonely ranch, living each day the same as the last. The townspeople eventually stopped trying to include him in things. The invitations to church socials and barn dances dried up. He became like a fixture of the landscape, expected but not really noticed. Just the hermit rancher in the hills, the man who wanted to be left alone. But life has a way of changing our plans, of throwing things at us when we least expect it. Thomas had built his whole world around isolation and safety, around avoiding pain by avoiding connection. He thought he could control his life by controlling who came into it. He had no idea that everything was about to change, that one freezing November evening would shatter his carefully constructed solitude and teach him that the human heart can't stay closed forever, no matter how hard we try to lock it away. November had come to Montana with a vengeance that year. The cold was the kind that got into your bones and wouldn't let go, no matter how many layers you wore. Thomas had been watching the sky all day, seeing the clouds build up dark and heavy. Snow was coming. He could feel it in the air, smell it on the wind. He needed to check the fence lines on the eastern part of his property before the storm hit. Make sure none of the cattle had wandered through any breaks. He saddled up Duke around 4 in the afternoon, knowing he had maybe 2 hours of decent light left. The temperature was already dropping fast, and his breath came out in white puffs as he worked. Duke seemed nervous, dancing sideways and tossing his head. Animals always knew when bad weather was coming. Thomas patted the horse's neck and swung up into the saddle, pulling his coat tighter around him. The ride out to the eastern fence line took about 40 minutes. Thomas followed the creek bed part of the way, his eyes scanning the landscape out of habit. He'd ridden this route 1,000 times and knew every rock, every tree, every bend in the land. That's why he noticed right away when something was different. There was a dark shape near the creek, half hidden by some sagebrush. At first he thought maybe one of his cattle had gotten stuck or injured. But as Duke picked his way closer, Thomas's heart started beating faster. That wasn't a cow. He dismounted slowly, his hand automatically going to the rifle in his saddle holster. You couldn't be too careful out here, especially lately. The tensions between the settlers and the native tribes had been getting worse. There'd been fights, raids, killings on both sides. The army was involved now, making things even more complicated. Thomas had stayed out of it all, keeping to himself, but he knew the dangers were real. The figure lying in the rocks was a young man, and he was in bad shape. Real bad. Thomas could see that right away. He was Native American, probably in his early 20s, and he'd been shot. There was dried blood all over his buckskin shirt, dark and crusty. His face was pale under his brown skin, covered in sweat despite the freezing temperature. Fever, Thomas recognized. The man's eyes were barely open, just slits, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. For a moment, Thomas just stood there, his mind racing. Every practical instinct told him to ride away, to pretend he'd never seen this. Getting involved with a wounded native man could bring nothing but trouble. What if his people thought Thomas had shot him? What if the army found out he'd helped him? Either way could end badly. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to leave. But then the young man's eyes opened a bit wider and found Thomas's face. There was no threat in that look, no anger, just pain and a desperate, wordless plea. Those eyes were asking for help, asking for a chance to live. And Thomas saw something in them that he recognized, the same thing he'd seen in his own reflection for the past 5 years. A kind of deep hurt, a weariness, but underneath it all a stubborn will to keep going. Thomas knelt down beside the stranger, checking him over with experienced hands. The bullet wound was in his left shoulder, and it looked like the bullet had gone clean through. That was good, at least, but the wound was infected. That much was clear from the smell and the heat radiating from it. The fever was burning through the young man's body like a wildfire. His lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. And Thomas guessed he'd been out here for at least a couple of days. Maybe longer. The stranger tried to say something, his lips moving, but only a weak croak came out. His throat was probably too dry to form words. Thomas pulled his canteen from his belt and carefully lifted the man's head, dribbling a bit of water into his mouth. The young man swallowed reflexively, then coughed, but his eyes showed gratitude. Thomas gave him a bit more water, not too much. Too much too fast could make him sick. Duke was getting more agitated, stamping his feet and pulling at the reins Thomas had looped over a branch. The horse could probably smell the blood and the sickness. Thomas looked up at the darkening sky. Those clouds were getting closer and the temperature was dropping even more. If he left this man here, he'd be dead by morning, either from the fever or from freezing to death. Maybe both. But if he took him back to the cabin, If he helped him, there was no telling what might happen. The risks were real and serious. Yet as Thomas looked down at the dying man, he found he couldn't walk away. Maybe it was because he'd felt so close to death himself after losing his wife. Maybe it was because he was tired of being afraid, tired of living so small and closed off. Or maybe it was just the simple fact that this was another human being who needed help. And Thomas still had enough humanity left in him to care about that. He made his decision. Working quickly now, Thomas got the young man onto Duke's back, which wasn't easy. The stranger was dead weight, barely conscious, and Thomas wasn't as young as he used to be. Duke didn't like it one bit, sidestepping and rolling his eyes, but Thomas managed to get the man draped across the saddle. He'd have to walk Duke back to the cabin, leading him carefully so the injured man didn't fall off. The trip back seemed to take forever. The wind was picking up, cutting through Thomas's coat like it was made of paper. His fingers were going numb and his feet felt like blocks of ice in his boots. The stranger kept slipping to one side or the other, and Thomas had to stop every few minutes to adjust him. A couple of times the man cried out in pain, words in a language Thomas didn't understand, his voice weak and broken. By the time the cabin came into view, full dark had fallen and the first snowflakes were starting to drift down from the sky. Thomas had never been so glad to see his home. He got the young man down from Duke's back and half carried, half dragged him to the cabin door. Duke would have to wait a bit longer for his rub down and feed. Right now, Thomas had to focus on keeping this stranger alive. He kicked the door open and brought the man inside, laying him on the floor near the fireplace. The cabin was cold, the fire having died down to just embers while he'd been gone. Thomas worked fast, building up the fire first, getting heat going. Then he lit some lamps so he could see what he was doing. The young man was unconscious now, which was probably a mercy. What Thomas had to do next was going to hurt. As he gathered his medical supplies, such as they were, Thomas wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Outside, the wind howled and the snow started falling harder. The storm had arrived, and inside a mysterious stranger lay dying on his floor, bringing with him questions and dangers that Thomas couldn't begin to imagine. But there was no going back now. He'd made his choice and he'd see it through, whatever came of it. The first night was the worst. Thomas worked by lamplight, cutting away the blood-soaked buckskin shirt to get a better look at the wound. What he found wasn't pretty. The bullet hole in the shoulder was angry and red, oozing a mixture of blood and pus. The infection had set in deep, and the fever was raging so hot that Thomas could feel the heat coming off the young man's skin from inches away. Thomas had learned field medicine during his time in the cavalry, years ago before he'd come west to start the ranch. He'd seen plenty of bullet wounds and fevers back then, had helped the company doctor patch up soldiers after skirmishes, but that had been a long time ago, and he'd never been the one completely responsible for someone's life. Still, the knowledge was there, buried in his memory, and he pulled it out now when he needed it most. First, he had to clean the wound. He put a pot of water on to boil, then pulled out a bottle of whiskey from his cupboard. He'd been saving it for special occasions, but this qualified. While the water heated, he used the whiskey to clean his hands and the tools he'd need. A sharp knife, some clean cloth torn into strips, a needle and thread. The young man stirred a bit as Thomas worked, mumbling words in his own language, but he didn't wake up. That was probably for the best. When the water was boiling, Thomas let it cool just a bit, then used it to flush out the wound. The man did cry out then, his body going rigid, but he still didn't fully wake. Thomas worked as quickly and gently as he could, cleaning away the infected tissue, making sure the bullet really had gone all the way through. It had, thank goodness. If he'd had to dig a bullet out, the chances of survival would have dropped considerably. Once the wound was as clean as he could get it, Thomas packed it with cloth soaked in whiskey. It would hurt like hell when the man woke up, but it was the best way to fight the infection. Then he wrapped the shoulder tight with clean bandages, trying to remember everything he'd learned about stopping bleeding and preventing further infection. His hand shook a little as he worked, from cold and tiredness and the weight of responsibility. But the wound was only part of the problem. The fever was just as dangerous, maybe more so. Thomas had seen strong men die from fever, their bodies just burning up from the inside until there was nothing left. He got a bucket of cool water and some more clean cloths and started sponging down the stranger's face and chest, trying to bring his temperature down. The man's skin was like fire to the touch, and he was shivering violently despite the heat coming off him. After he'd done all he could medically, Thomas got the stranger moved onto his own bed. He couldn't leave him on the hard floor. The young man was light, thinner than he should be, probably from days without food and water. Thomas covered him with blankets, then sat down in the chair beside the bed, suddenly exhausted. Outside, the storm was howling, snow piling up against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire crackled and the lamps flickered, and a dying man breathed in shallow, ragged gasps. Thomas must have dozed off because he jerked awake to the sound of the stranger crying out. The young man was thrashing in the bed, tangled in the blankets, clearly trapped in some kind of fever dream. Thomas grabbed his arms gently, trying to calm him. The stranger's eyes were open but unseeing, looking at something Thomas couldn't see. He was shouting now, words tumbling out in his own language, urgent and afraid. For hours, Thomas sat with him, changing the cool cloths on his forehead, giving him sips of water when he was calm enough to swallow, holding him down when the fever dreams got too violent. It was like wrestling with ghosts, trying to keep this young man from slipping away into whatever dark place the fever was trying to drag him toward. Thomas talked to him sometimes, not expecting him to understand, just letting his voice be something solid and real to hold on to. He talked about the ranch, about the weather, about nothing in particular, just words to fill the darkness. The second day was more of the same. Thomas would doze in the chair for an hour or so, then wake to check on his patient, change the bandages, try to get some broth into him. He'd made a simple soup from dried meat and vegetables, and every few hours he'd spoon a bit into the stranger's mouth, coaxing him to swallow. Most of it dribbled back out, but some of it went down. That was something, at least. The storm had settled in for real now, dumping snow like it would never stop. Thomas couldn't have gone to town for help even if he'd wanted to. Not that he would have wanted to. Bringing a wounded native man to the doctor in Copper Ridge would have caused all kinds of problems. Might have even gotten the young man killed or thrown in jail. No, Thomas was on his own with this, and that was fine. He was used to being on his own. By the third day, Thomas was running on fumes. He hadn't slept more than a few hours total, grabbing catnaps in the chair when the stranger seemed stable. His eyes were gritty and burning, and his back ached from sitting hunched over. He'd barely eaten anything himself, too focused on trying to keep his patient alive. The cabin was a mess with dirty cloths and bowls scattered around, but Thomas couldn't bring himself to care about that. But that afternoon, something changed. The stranger had been quiet for a while, his breathing a bit easier, and when Thomas checked his forehead, he felt a tiny bit cooler. Not much, but enough to give Thomas a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the fever was starting to break. Maybe all this work wasn't for nothing. That night, Thomas actually managed to sleep for a solid 3 hours, curled up in the chair with a blanket. When he woke, dawnlight was coming through the windows and the cabin was quiet except for the crackling fire. He stood up, his joints popping and protesting, and went to check on the stranger. What he found made his heart leap with relief. The young man's eyes were open. Really open this time. Not just fever-clouded slits, but clear and aware. He was looking around the cabin, taking everything in, and when his eyes found Thomas, there was understanding in them. He knew where he was, knew that someone had helped him. His lips moved, and a single word came out, so quiet Thomas almost didn't hear it. It wasn't in English, but the meaning was clear enough. Thank you. Thomas felt his eyes sting with sudden tears, which surprised him. He'd been holding it together for 3 days straight. And now that the crisis seemed to be passing, all his emotions wanted to come flooding out at once. He blinked hard and cleared his throat. The stranger tried to sit up and immediately gasped in pain, his face going white. Thomas gently pushed him back down. There would be time for sitting up later. Right now he needed rest and food and more healing. Over the next few days, the improvement continued. The fever broke completely on the 4th morning, leaving the stranger weak and shaky but alive. Thomas helped him eat real food, starting with broth and working up to bread and soft vegetables. The young man slept a lot, which was good. Sleep was the body's way of healing itself, and when he was awake, he watched Thomas with those dark, intelligent eyes taking everything in. They couldn't really talk to each other, not with words. But somehow they managed to communicate anyway. The stranger pointed to himself and said what Thomas assumed was his name. It sounded like Chayton, though Thomas wasn't sure he was saying it right. He pointed to himself and said, "Thomas," and the young man repeated it carefully, his accent making it sound different but recognizable. That was a start, at least. They had names now, were more than just stranger and helper. They were 2 men, both trying to survive in a hard world. By the end of the first week, Chayton was strong enough to sit up for short periods, though his shoulder still hurt badly, and his movements were stiff and careful. Thomas had moved him to the chair near the fireplace during the day, finding it easier to keep an eye on him there. The storm had finally blown itself out, leaving the world outside buried in snow that sparkled blindingly bright in the sunlight. The language barrier should have made things awkward, but somehow it didn't. Thomas found that you could say a lot without words if you paid attention. Chayton was good at this, his face expressive and his hands quick to gesture when he wanted to communicate something. And Thomas, who'd spent 5 years talking mainly to his horse, discovered he was better at reading these signs than he'd expected. One afternoon, Chayton pointed to the wound on his shoulder, then made a motion like firing a gun. Thomas nodded, understanding the question. "Who shot you?" Chayton's face darkened, and he began to tell his story through a combination of gestures and drawings in the ashes near the fireplace. Thomas watched, putting the pieces together slowly. Chayton and some other men from his tribe had been out hunting buffalo. They weren't bothering anyone, just trying to get meat for their people before winter set in hard. But they'd run into a group of white buffalo hunters, the kind who killed for hides and sport rather than food, leaving the meat to rot. There'd been an argument, then shooting. 2 of Chayton's friends had been killed right there. Chayton had been hit but managed to escape, riding for days until his horse collapsed and he had to continue on foot. That's when the infection and fever had caught up with him, leaving him to die by that creek bed. The waste of it made Thomas angry. Killing over buffalo, over territory, over differences that seemed so small when you really thought about it. 2 young men dead, Chayton nearly joining them, and for what? He wished he had words to express his sorrow, his disgust at the whole senseless situation. Instead, he just put his hand on Chayton's good shoulder, a gesture of understanding and sympathy. Chayton looked at him, and something passed between them, a recognition that they were both just trying to live their lives in a world that seemed determined to make that as hard as possible. Thomas found himself telling his own story, even though he knew Chayton couldn't understand most of the words. He talked about his wife, how she'd died, how he'd shut himself away from everyone afterward. He pointed to her rocking chair in the corner, to the curtains she'd made, to the little touches around the cabin that were hers. Chayton listened intently, and even though the words were foreign, he seemed to understand the emotion behind them. Loss was loss in any language. Grief was universal. As the days passed, they developed a routine. Thomas would make breakfast, usually something simple like eggs and bread or oatmeal, and they'd eat together in companionable silence. Then Thomas would check Chayton's wound, changing the bandage and applying a poultice made from herbs he'd learned about from a trapper years ago. The wound was healing well, pink healthy tissue replacing the angry red of infection. Chayton's strength was coming back too, a little more each day. In the afternoons, they'd work on teaching each other words. Chayton would point to something, say the word in his language, and Thomas would repeat it, usually getting it wrong several times before Chayton would nod with approval. Then Thomas would say the English word, and Chayton would try it out. Fire, water, food, horse, simple things. But it gave them a way to start building a bridge between their worlds. Thomas learned that Chayton was Lakota, from a tribe that ranged across the northern plains. He learned that Chayton had 3 brothers and 2 sisters, that his mother was alive but his father had died 2 winters ago in a battle with the army. He learned that Chayton loved horses and was considered one of the best riders in his tribe. All of this came through pictures drawn in ash, through gestures, through the few words they shared. And Chayton learned about Thomas, about the loneliness that had eaten at him for 5 years, about the ranch and the cattle and the simple, hard life Thomas had built for himself. He seemed to understand why Thomas lived alone, nodding sympathetically when Thomas tried to explain about the pain of losing someone you loved. Maybe the Lakota had a better understanding of grief, Thomas thought. They seemed to accept it as part of life rather than something to hide from. One evening, about 10 days after Thomas had found him, Chayton stood up from his chair and walked slowly to the window. He was still weak, still favoring his injured shoulder, but he was moving on his own now. He looked out at the snow-covered land, at the mountains in the distance, and said something in Lakota. Then he turned to Thomas and tried to find the English words. "My people," he said slowly, pointing toward the west. "Worry," Thomas understood. Chayton's tribe didn't know where he was, didn't know if he was alive or dead. They'd be worried, maybe even grieving. He needed to get back to them to let them know he'd survived. But he wasn't strong enough yet for that journey. Not in this cold, not with his shoulder still healing. Thomas tried to convey this, pointing at Chayton's shoulder, at the snow outside, shaking his head. Chayton looked frustrated but nodded. He understood too. A few more days, maybe a week, and he'd be strong enough to travel. Until then, he was stuck here, this strange white man's guest in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. It was an odd situation for both of them, something neither could have imagined a few weeks ago. But what surprised Thomas most was that he didn't want Chayton to leave. For the first time in 5 years, the cabin didn't feel empty. There was life here again. Conversation, even if it was mostly gestures and broken words. Companionship of a kind he'd forgotten he needed. He'd saved Chayton's life, yes, but in a way, Chayton was saving his too, reminding him that he was still human, still capable of connection, still part of the world even if he tried to cut himself off from it. They spent their evenings by the fire, Chayton wrapped in blankets and Thomas in his usual chair. Sometimes they'd try to teach each other words. Sometimes they'd just sit in comfortable silence, listening to the wind outside and the crackle of burning wood. Thomas would whittle, an old habit from his childhood, and Chayton would watch, occasionally asking with gestures if he could try. Thomas handed over the knife and a piece of wood, and Chayton's hands moved with surprising skill despite his injury, carving out the shape of a horse. These were peaceful times, gentle and quiet, and Thomas found himself savoring them. He knew they couldn't last. Chayton would heal and leave, heading back to his people and his life. Thomas would be alone again. But for now, in this small window of time, two men from different worlds had found something valuable, understanding, friendship, a recognition of their shared humanity that went deeper than language or culture or the conflicts raging around them. As Thomas watched Chayton work on his carving, the young man's face serious with concentration, he realized something important. He'd spent 5 years trying to protect himself from more pain by shutting everyone out. But in saving Chayton, in opening his door to someone who needed help, he'd remembered what it felt like to matter to someone, to be needed. And that feeling, scary as it was, felt right. It felt like coming back to life after a long, cold winter. 2 weeks had passed since Thomas found Chayton dying by the creek. The young warrior was almost fully healed now, moving around the cabin with only a slight stiffness in his shoulder. The wound had closed up nicely, leaving what would be a permanent scar but no lasting damage. He could use his arm again, though Thomas could see him wince sometimes when he moved it the wrong way. But he was strong, healthy, and ready to go home. Thomas had known this day was coming. He'd tried not to think about it too much, but every morning when he woke up, he'd wonder if this would be the day Chayton would tell him it was time to leave. And finally, on a clear, cold morning with the sun making the snow sparkle like diamonds, that day arrived. Thomas woke to find Chayton already up and dressed in his buckskin clothes, which Thomas had cleaned and mended as best he could. The young man was standing by the door, looking out at the brightening sky, and there was something in his posture that Thomas recognized, the readiness of someone preparing for a journey. His heart sank, but he pushed the feeling down. This was right. Chayton had a family, a tribe, a whole life waiting for him. Thomas had no right to want him to stay. Chayton turned when he heard Thomas get up, and their eyes met. No words were needed. They both knew. Chayton came over and sat at the table, and using the English words he'd learned mixed with gestures, he made his meaning clear. He had to go back to his people. They would think him dead. His mother would be grieving. He needed to let them know he was alive, and he needed to do it soon. Thomas nodded, his throat tight. He understood. He made breakfast, probably the last one they'd share, and they ate it slowly, neither one in a hurry despite Chayton's need to leave. It was funny, Thomas thought, how you could get attached to someone in just 2 weeks, how the cabin that had felt too empty with just him in it would feel even emptier once Chayton was gone. After breakfast, Thomas packed provisions for Chayton's journey. Dried meat, bread, some vegetables that would keep, a full water skin, matches, and a thick wool blanket. It wasn't much, but it would help Chayton get back to his people safely. As he worked, Chayton watched him, and Thomas could feel the weight of things unsaid between them. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper, a friendship that had formed in the most unlikely of circumstances. Then Thomas did something that surprised even himself. He led Chayton out to the small barn where he kept Duke and 2 other horses. He pointed to a sturdy paint mare, a good strong animal with kind eyes. "For you," Thomas said, gesturing from the horse to Chayton. "Take her." Chayton's eyes widened. He shook his head, trying to refuse. Horses were valuable, especially out here, and he'd already taken so much from Thomas. But Thomas was insistent, putting the halter in Chayton's hands. The young warrior had a long journey ahead of him, and he'd need a good horse to make it. Besides, Thomas wanted to give him something. Wanted Chayton to have a piece of this place, and this time they'd shared. Finally, Chayton accepted the gift. But his face showed he understood the magnitude of it. He placed his hand over his heart, then reached out and gripped Thomas's forearm in a firm clasp. It was a warrior's gesture, one of respect and equality. Thomas returned the grip, feeling the strength in Chayton's hand, the life that he'd helped preserve. They stood like that for a long moment. Two men who'd started as strangers and become something more. Thomas helped Chayton saddle the mare and load the provisions. They worked in silence, both drawing out the task longer than necessary. Finally, there was nothing left to do. Chayton mounted up, settling into the saddle with the ease of someone who'd been riding since childhood. He looked down at Thomas, and for a second his composure cracked. His eyes were bright, and Thomas wondered if he was fighting tears the same way Thomas was. Chayton said something in Lakota, a long string of words that Thomas couldn't understand but felt in his chest anyway. Then in halting English he added, "You saved Chayton. Chayton no forget. Never forget." He placed his hand over his heart again, then pointed to Thomas, a promise in the gesture. This kindness, this mercy shown by a white man to a native warrior in a time of such hatred and fear, would be remembered. Would be honored. Thomas could only nod, not trusting his voice. He raised his hand in farewell, and Chayton returned the gesture. Then the young warrior turned the mare toward the west, toward the mountains and the lands beyond where his people waited. He didn't look back, and Thomas was glad for that. Looking back would have made it harder for both of them. Thomas stood there in the cold morning air, watching horse and rider grow smaller and smaller until they were just a dark speck against the white landscape. Then they disappeared over a rise, and Chayton was gone. Thomas stood there a while longer, his breath clouding in the freezing air, feeling the silence settle back around him like a heavy coat. When he finally turned back to the cabin, it looked smaller somehow, more fragile. He went inside, and the emptiness hit him like a physical blow. The chair where Chayton had sat was empty. The bed where he'd fought off fever was neatly made. The little wooden horse he'd carved sat on the table, left behind as a gift for Thomas. The cabin was clean and organized and utterly, completely empty. Thomas picked up the wooden horse, running his fingers over the smooth carving. It was beautifully done, every detail perfect. He set it on the shelf above the fireplace next to a small portrait of his wife. Two reminders of people who'd touched his life, changed it in ways big and small. His wife had taught him how to love. Chayton had reminded him how to care about someone other than himself. The rest of that day passed in a blur. Thomas tried to keep busy, doing chores around the ranch, checking on the cattle, fixing things that didn't really need fixing. But his heart wasn't in it. He kept expecting to turn around and see Chayton there, watching him with those intelligent dark eyes or trying out a new English word. The silence was oppressive, worse than it had been before, because now Thomas knew what it was like to not be alone. That evening, he sat in his usual chair by the fire, a cup of coffee going cold in his hands. He thought about Chayton making his way west, hopefully getting closer to his people with every mile. He hoped the young man would make it safely, that he'd find his family and his tribe and be welcomed home. He hoped Chayton's life would be long and full of good things. And for the first time in 5 years, Thomas let himself hope for his own future too. Maybe he didn't have to live like this forever, shut away from the world, protecting himself from pain by refusing to feel anything at all. Maybe there was a middle ground, a way to honor his wife's memory while still being part of the living world. Chayton had shown him that just by being there, by needing help and accepting it, by sharing those 2 weeks of quiet companionship. Thomas didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if he'd ever see Chayton again, though something in him suspected their paths might cross once more. Life had a way of bringing people together when they needed each other. For now, he was alone again, but it was a different kind of alone. Not quite so heavy, not quite so hopeless. The door he'd locked shut 5 years ago had been cracked open, just a bit, and some light had gotten in. Outside, night fell over the Montana wilderness. The stars came out, bright and cold and infinite, and inside his cabin, Thomas McKenna sat by his fire holding a carved wooden horse and let himself feel something he'd thought was lost forever. Not happiness, not yet, but the possibility of it someday, and for now that was enough. 3 days had passed since Chayton left. 3 long, quiet days where Thomas went through the motions of living without really feeling present. He fed the animals, checked the fences, cooked his meals, and slept fitfully in his bed. But his mind was somewhere else, wondering if Chayton had made it home safely, hoping the young warrior hadn't run into any trouble on his journey west. On the morning of the 4th day, Thomas woke before dawn as usual. Something felt different, but he couldn't put his finger on what. The cabin was dark and quiet. The fire burned down to just glowing embers. Outside there was no wind, which was unusual for this time of year. Everything felt too still, like the world was holding its breath. He got dressed and went to build up the fire, moving through his morning routine automatically. Coffee first, then he'd head out to tend to Duke and the other horses. Maybe ride out and check on the cattle in the south pasture. Just another day, same as all the others would be from now on, except his chest felt tight and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The sound hit him just as he was pouring his first cup of coffee. It was faint at first, so faint he thought he might be imagining it. A rumbling like distant thunder, but constant and growing louder. Thomas set down the coffee pot and moved to the window, his heart starting to beat faster. Thunder in winter was rare, and besides, the sky had been clear when he'd glanced out earlier. What he saw when he looked out the window made his blood run cold. His hands gripped the window frame so hard his knuckles went white, and for a second he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Couldn't do anything but stare at the impossible sight before him. Horses. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. They surrounded his property as far as he could see in the dim pre-dawn light. A massive circle of mounted warriors sitting perfectly still and silent. The rumbling sound was their horses, hundreds of hooves shifting on the frozen ground, hundreds of large animals breathing in the cold air. The sound of an army. Thomas's rifle was across the room, leaning against the wall by the door. For a wild second he thought about grabbing it, but that impulse died quickly. What good would one rifle do against hundreds of warriors? If they wanted him dead, he was already dead. There was no fighting his way out of this, no running, no hiding. His cabin was surrounded completely, trapped like a mouse in a box. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. Had they found out he'd helped Chayton? Was this revenge? But that didn't make sense. If they wanted revenge for taking in one of their warriors, they would have just killed him quietly, not shown up with what looked like the entire fighting force of a tribe. This was something else, something bigger. But Thomas couldn't figure out what. The sun was starting to come up now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and in that growing light, Thomas could see the warriors more clearly. Their faces were painted, which sent another jolt of fear through him. War paint. They wore their finest clothes, feathers and beadwork and furs. Many carried weapons, lances and bows and rifles. They sat their horses with the easy confidence of men who'd been born in the saddle, and they all faced his cabin with an intensity that was terrifying. At the front of the formation, closest to his gate, Thomas spotted a figure that made his heart lurch. Chayton. The young warrior sat on the paint mare Thomas had given him. Looking healthy and strong, his shoulder clearly healed enough for him to ride and fight. But there was no threat in his posture, no anger. Instead, his face was calm, almost peaceful, and next to him sat an older man wearing an elaborate feather headdress that marked him as someone important. A chief, Thomas realized. A leader. For several long minutes, nothing happened. The warriors just sat there, silent and watchful, while Thomas stood frozen at his window trying to understand what was happening. The sun climbed higher, turning the snow-covered landscape golden, making the warriors' painted faces stand out in stark detail. It would have been beautiful if Thomas hadn't been so terrified. Finally, he knew he had to do something. Hiding in his cabin wasn't going to change anything. If they wanted to kill him, they'd just burn him out or break down the door. Better to face whatever was coming with some dignity, standing on his own 2 feet. His hands were shaking as he moved away from the window, and he had to take several deep breaths to calm himself. He thought about his wife, about Chayton, about the life he'd lived and the choices he'd made. If this was the end, at least he'd die knowing he'd done one good thing. He'd saved a life instead of taking one. That counted for something, didn't it? That meant something in the grand scheme of things, even if nobody but him and Chayton would ever know about it. Thomas walked to the door, his legs feeling like they might give out at any second. He left his rifle where it was. Going out there armed would be seen as a threat, and besides, it wouldn't help him anyway. His only chance, if he had one at all, was to show that he meant no harm, that he was just a man standing his ground on his own property. He put his hand on the door handle, feeling the cold metal under his palm. This was it. Whatever came next would determine if he lived or died, if his story ended here or continued. He said a quiet prayer, though he wasn't sure who he was praying to or what he was asking for. Courage, maybe, understanding, mercy. Thomas opened the door and stepped out into the cold morning air. The temperature hit him immediately, well below freezing, but he barely felt it. All his attention was on the warriors surrounding his home, on the hundreds of eyes watching him. He walked forward slowly, deliberately, his hands visible and empty at his sides. He went down the 3 steps from his porch and stood in his yard, facing the warriors at his gate. The silence was absolute. Not a single warrior moved or spoke. Their horses stood still as statues, as if even the animals understood the weight of this moment. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, could see his breath clouding white in the freezing air. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching out impossibly long. Then Chayton dismounted. The young warrior moved with fluid grace, landing lightly on the frozen ground. The older man next to him, the chief, also dismounted, his movements slower but no less dignified. They stood for a moment, looking at Thomas across the distance of the yard, and then they began to walk toward him. Thomas stood his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to do something other than just stand there waiting. But he forced himself to stay still, to meet this moment head-on. If they were coming to kill him, he'd face it like a man, and if they were coming for some other reason, well, he'd find out soon enough. As Chayton and the chief got closer, Thomas could see their faces clearly. And what he saw there wasn't anger or hatred or threat. Chayton looked almost proud, his eyes bright and his expression warm. The chief's face was harder to read, weathered and lined with age and responsibility, but there was something in his eyes that looked almost like respect. They stopped a few feet from Thomas, close enough to touch but maintaining a respectful distance. Thomas's mind was racing, trying to figure out what to say, what to do. But before he could think of anything, Chayton smiled at him, that same open, genuine smile Thomas had seen in the cabin during those 2 weeks together. And Thomas realized with a sudden rush of hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end he'd feared. Maybe this was something else entirely, something he couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. Chayton spoke first, his English still halting but much improved from when he'd left. He must have been practicing, Thomas thought with a flash of warmth. The young warrior gestured to the older man beside him and said clearly, "My father, Chief." Thomas's eyes widened. Father? But Chayton had told him through gestures that his father was dead. Then understanding hit him like a lightning bolt. Not his birth father, but someone who held the position of chief in his tribe, a leader, a man of great importance. And this leader had come here with hundreds of warriors all the way to Thomas's remote ranch, for a reason that Thomas still couldn't quite grasp. Another man stepped forward from the group of warriors, younger than the chief but older than Chayton. He positioned himself next to the chief and spoke in English, clear and precise. "I am Running Fox. I speak for Chief Red Cloud of the Oglala Lakota." His voice was formal, carrying easily in the still morning air. "The chief does not speak your tongue, but he has much to say to you. I will speak his words." Thomas just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Chief Red Cloud. Even Thomas, isolated as he'd been, had heard that name. Red Cloud was famous, a powerful leader who'd fought the army to a standstill, who'd won concessions that no other tribe had managed. And he was standing in Thomas's yard, looking at him with those dark, measuring eyes. Red Cloud began to speak in Lakota, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the weight of authority. Running Fox translated, his English formal but easy to understand. "My son Chayton returned to us 3 days ago. We had thought him dead. For 2 weeks his mother mourned. His brothers and sisters prepared for the ceremonies of death. Our people grieved for a young warrior lost too soon." Thomas felt his stomach clench. He glanced at Chayton, who was watching him steadily, that small smile still on his face. This wasn't going where Thomas had feared, but he still didn't understand what was happening. Red Cloud continued, and Running Fox translated. Chayton told us how he came to be alive, how he was shot by white buffalo hunters who killed his companions for no reason, how he fled and rode until his horse died beneath him, how he walked until the sickness took him, and he lay dying by a creek waiting for death to claim him as it had claimed his friends. The chief paused, and the silence stretched out. Every warrior was listening, Thomas realized. This wasn't just for him. This was for all of them, a public declaration of something important. And then, Red Cloud's words came through Running Fox. A white man found him, a man who lived alone, who had no tribe of his own, who had no reason to help a Lakota warrior in a time when our peoples are enemies. This man could have left my son to die. He could have shot him and taken his possessions. He could have turned him over to the army for a reward. These are all things that would have been easy, that would have been safe. Red Cloud's eyes locked onto Thomas's, and Thomas couldn't look away. There was power in that gaze, an intensity that made him feel like the chief could see right into his soul. But this man, Thomas McKenna, did none of those things. Running Fox's voice rang out clearly. Instead, he brought my son into his home. He fought the fever that would have killed him. He gave him food and water and shelter. He asked nothing in return. He expected no reward. He simply saw another human being who needed help, and he gave it freely. Chayton stepped forward then and pulled aside his shirt, showing the healed wound on his shoulder. He spoke in English, wanting Thomas to understand directly. You save life. You give medicine. You give food. You give horse. His voice grew stronger. You give brother kindness in time of hate. Red Cloud spoke again, and Running Fox translated. My son says you lost your wife, that you understand grief, that you live alone because you are afraid to lose anyone else. He says you are a good man who has forgotten how to trust the world. But you trusted him. You helped him when helping could have cost you everything. Thomas felt his eyes burning. He blinked hard, trying to keep his composure. Around him, hundreds of warriors sat watching this exchange, and Thomas suddenly understood. This was ceremony. This was ritual. This was important in ways he was only beginning to grasp. The chief's next words hit Thomas like a wave. There is a debt between us now, Thomas McKenna. A debt of blood and honor. You gave me back my son, and such a gift cannot be ignored, cannot be forgotten. My people do not forget kindness, especially from those who have no reason to show it. Red Cloud turned and made a gesture, and several warriors dismounted, carrying items that they laid at Thomas's feet. Beautifully beaded clothing, the leather soft and worked to perfection. A headdress with eagle feathers, each one earned through deeds of courage and honor. A painted shield, its surface decorated with symbols Thomas didn't understand but could feel the power of. A ceremonial pipe, its bowl carved from red stone, its stem wrapped in leather and decorated with beads and feathers. Running Fox explained as each item was laid down. These are gifts of the highest honor. The clothing is made by the chief's own wife, worked on through many moons. The headdress represents courage and protection. The shield carries the symbols of the chief's own family line. The pipe is for peace and brotherhood. But Red Cloud wasn't finished. He spoke again, his voice rising with passion, and Running Fox translated with equal intensity. These gifts are symbols, but they are not the true gift. The true gift is this. From this day forward, you are under the protection of the Lakota Nation. Your land is sacred to us. Your cattle will not be touched. Your property will not be raided. Any warrior who harms you or what is yours answers to me personally. Thomas's legs felt weak. He wanted to sit down, to process what he was hearing, but he forced himself to stay standing. This was impossible. This was more than he'd ever imagined. More than this, the translation continued. You are now counted as a friend to our people, a brother to the Lakota. If you need help, if you face danger, if you call out to us, we will come. 300 warriors came here today so that all would know this truth, so that all would witness this bond. Red Cloud stepped forward and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder, speaking directly to him even though Thomas couldn't understand the words. But he understood the gesture, the warmth in those ancient eyes, the respect in that touch. Running Fox translated softly. You gave me back my son. I give you my protection and my friendship. This is the way of our people. This is our honor. Chayton came forward then, and he embraced Thomas like a brother, holding him tight. Thomas felt something break open inside him, all the loneliness and grief and fear he'd been carrying for 5 years. Tears ran down his face, and he didn't try to stop them. Let the warriors see. Let them know what this meant to him. When Chaitan stepped back, he was crying too. He placed his hand over his heart and then reached out, touching Thomas's chest over his heart. "Brother," he said in English. "Forever." Thomas found his voice finally rough and shaking. "Brother," he agreed. "Forever." Around them, the warriors began to make sounds, not war cries, but something else. Approval, acceptance, celebration. The sound grew and grew, echoing across the snow-covered land, announcing to the world that something important had happened here. That a bridge had been built between two worlds, founded on nothing more complicated than one man's decision to help another in his darkest hour. Thomas McKenna had been alone for 5 years, had built walls around his heart to protect himself from more pain, but those walls were crumbling now, brought down by an act of simple human kindness and the honor of a people who valued such things. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a brother, a tribe, a connection to something larger than himself. And it had all started with the choice to help a dying stranger on a freezing November evening. The ceremony continued for another hour as the sun climbed higher in the winter sky. The warriors performed rituals that Thomas didn't fully understand but could feel the power of. They sang songs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient, their voices rising and falling in harmonies that made his skin prickle. Some of the warriors rode in circles around the property, a demonstration of their skill and their commitment to protecting this land and the man who lived on it. Red Cloud presented Thomas with the sacred pipe, showing him through gestures how to hold it, how to respect it. Running Fox explained that this pipe was to be smoked only on special occasions, when seeking wisdom or making important decisions. It was a connection to the spiritual world, to the ancestors, to the forces that guided the tribe. That such a thing was being given to a white man, an outsider, was almost unheard of. Thomas held the pipe carefully, feeling the weight of it, the smoothness of the carved stone bowl. He wanted to say something profound, something worthy of this incredible honor, but words failed him. Instead, he simply bowed his head to Red Cloud, a gesture of respect and gratitude that needed no translation. The chief placed his hand on Thomas's head for a moment, a blessing, and Thomas felt something shift inside him, a healing he hadn't known he needed. As the morning wore on, some of the warriors began to dismount and move around the property. Thomas's first instinct was fear, but Chaitan stayed close to him, explaining in his improving English what was happening. The warriors were examining his fences, looking at his cattle, checking his water sources. They were learning his land so they would recognize it, so they would know what was under their protection. Several older women had come with the warriors. Thomas noticed, and they began building fires and preparing food. This wasn't just a ceremony, it was becoming a gathering, a celebration. One of the women, her face kind and weathered with age, approached Thomas with a bowl of food. Running Fox translated her words. "This is the chief's wife, Whitebird. She offers you food from our people." Thomas accepted the bowl gratefully. It was some kind of stew, rich and hearty, with meat and roots and herbs he didn't recognize but tasted wonderful. He was suddenly aware that he'd been too nervous to eat breakfast and he was starving. Whitebird watched him eat with approval, then said something to her husband. Red Cloud nodded and spoke to Running Fox. "The chief's wife says you are too thin, that you do not eat enough. She says this is what happens when a man lives alone without a woman to care for him." Running Fox smiled slightly. "She wishes you to know that if you ever take a wife, she would be honored to help prepare the wedding feast." Thomas couldn't help but laugh, the sound surprising him. When was the last time he'd laughed? Really laughed? "Tell her I'm honored," he said to Running Fox. "And tell her this stew is the best thing I've eaten in years." The translation brought a smile to Whitebird's face, and she patted his cheek like he was one of her own children before moving away to serve food to the warriors. Thomas felt warmth spread through his chest. These people, who had every reason to hate him just for being white, for being a settler on land that had been theirs, were treating him like family. It was overwhelming and beautiful and slightly terrifying all at once. Chaitan stayed by his side throughout the morning, acting as a bridge between Thomas and the other warriors. Young men came to meet the white brother who had saved one of their own. They clasped his arm, the warriors greeting, and spoke words of respect and gratitude. Older warriors, scarred and weathered from years of fighting, looked him in the eye and nodded their approval. Thomas felt accepted in a way he'd never experienced before, not even in his own culture. As the sun reached its peak, Red Cloud called for attention. The warriors gathered close and the chief spoke at length. Running Fox translated for Thomas. The chief was telling the story of Chaitin's rescue, of Thomas's kindness, and of the oath he was making before all the people. This oath would be carried back to every Lakota camp, shared around every fire. Thomas McKenna was brother to the tribe and all would know it. Then something happened that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. Red Cloud called Chaitin forward and placed the young warrior's hand in Thomas's, joining them together. He spoke words that Running Fox translated with emotion. My son was dead and you gave him back to life. My family was broken and you made it whole. You are not Lakota by blood, but you are Lakota by deed and by honor. I claim you as my son, as brother to Chaitin. From this day forward, you are part of my family. Thomas's vision blurred with tears. Adopted. He was being adopted into the chief's own family. It was too much, too overwhelming. He'd spent 5 years pushing everyone away, building walls, protecting himself from connection and loss. And now this incredible gift of family and belonging from the most unlikely source imaginable. Father, he said to Red Cloud, the English word feeling inadequate but all he had. I'm honored. I don't deserve this, Running Fox translated, and Red Cloud replied. You deserve this because you saw my son not as an enemy, not as a savage, not as a threat. You saw him as a man who needed help. That is worth more than gold, more than land, more than anything we could give you. The warriors began to prepare to leave as the afternoon light started to fade. They'd accomplished what they came for. The ceremony was complete, and they had a long journey back to their winter camp. But before they mounted up, many of them came to Thomas one last time, touching his shoulder, speaking words of farewell and promise. Chaitin lingered after the others had mounted. He and Thomas stood facing each other, and there was so much to say but no real need for words. They'd shared something profound, these two men from different worlds. They'd looked past all the reasons they should be enemies and found brotherhood instead. You come visit, Chaitin said, pointing west toward the mountains. My people, your people now, always welcome. And you, Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. Always welcome here. This is your home too. They embraced one final time and then Chaitin mounted the paint mare. Red Cloud raised his hand in farewell and Thomas raised his in return. The warriors began to move, the massive formation turning with precision, heading west toward their winter camps. Thomas watched them go, hundreds of riders moving across the snow like a river, until they were just dark specks in the distance and then nothing at all. The silence that fell after they left was different from any silence Thomas had known. It wasn't empty or lonely. It was full of possibility, of connection, of belonging. He walked slowly back to his cabin, looking at the gifts that had been left for him. The beaded clothing, the headdress, the shield, the pipe, symbols of honor, of family, of a bond that transcended the hatred and violence that divided their peoples. Inside the cabin, Thomas carefully arranged the gifts, giving them places of honor. The pipe went on the mantel next to the wooden horse Chaitin had carved, and the picture of his wife. 3 things that represented the journey his heart had taken: loss, opening up again, and finally connection. He sat in his chair by the fire that evening, but he wasn't alone anymore. Not really. Somewhere to the west, Chaitin was riding home with his people, probably telling stories about the lonely rancher who'd saved his life. And here, Thomas had his own story to hold on to. The story of how one act of compassion had changed everything, had brought 300 warriors to his gate not for war but for honor. Thomas McKenna had learned something important in these past weeks. He'd learned that the human heart, no matter how wounded, no matter how carefully guarded, still had the capacity to open up, still had the ability to connect, to care, to love in its many forms. Brotherhood, friendship, family, these things could come from the most unexpected places if you were brave enough to reach out your hand. The ranch didn't feel empty anymore. The silence didn't feel suffocating, because Thomas knew now that he wasn't truly alone, had never been alone. He was part of something larger, connected to people who valued honor and kindness and the simple human decency of helping someone in need. He had a brother in Chaitin, a father in Red Cloud, a family in the Lakota people who had claimed him as their own. As the fire crackled and the stars came out over Montana, Thomas allowed himself to think about the future for the first time in years. Not with dread or emptiness, but with something that felt almost like hope. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he wouldn't face it alone. He had people now, connections, bonds that would hold even across the distance and the cultural divide. His wife would have been proud of him, he thought. She'd always said he had a good heart, even when he couldn't see it himself. She'd told him that kindness mattered, that how we treat others in their darkest moments defines who we are. He'd forgotten that lesson in his grief, had hidden from it. But Chaitan had reminded him, had given him a chance to be the man his wife had always believed him to be. Thomas picked up the wooden horse from the mantel, running his fingers over the smooth carving. A falcon soaring free, that's what Chaitan's name meant. And in a way, that's what Chaitan had given him. Freedom from the prison of his own making, from the loneliness he'd wrapped around himself like chains, wings to fly again, to live again, to be part of the world again.